Montana Territory, autumn 1887. Samuel Garrett was a 42-year-old former copper miner from Butte who had spent a decade tunneling through rock 1,000 feet below the surface. He could not shake what he had learned underground. The temperature stabilizes with depth. The deeper you go, the steadier the air becomes. 8 feet down, the earth holds at 50 to 55 degrees year-round, no matter what the surface does. That autumn, while his neighbors were chinkling their log cabins and stacking cordwood, Samuel started digging beneath his barn floor. "You're wasting your time, Garrett," master builder Jonas Milright told him at the trading post. "Dirt don't keep you warm." The question was not whether it looked ridiculous. Everyone agreed it did. The problem was not the digging, it was the wind. Montana Territory winters did not just bring cold. They brought wind that stripped heat from any surface it touched. Log cabins, no matter how well chinked, leaked warmth through every crack and joint. The wind found the gaps. It always found the gaps. Samuel Garrett understood what his neighbors did not. Still air holds heat. Moving air steals it. Underground, there is no wind. He was a quiet man, methodical. His wife, Catherine, was 38, practical and cautious. They had 3 children, Margaret, 14, Raymond, 11, and Ruth, 7. The family had been in the territory for 5 years, long enough to know that winter was not a season. It was a test. Samuel had seen men freeze. He had pulled bodies from snowdrifts. He had watched families huddle around dying stoves, burning furniture when the cordwood ran out. The valley lost people every winter, and everyone accepted it as the cost of living in Montana Territory. But Samuel remembered the mines. 1,000 feet down, the rock walls stayed cool in summer and mild in winter. The air never moved. The temperature never changed. That constancy was not magic. It was geology. So he dug. The excavation took 6 weeks. He went down 10 feet beneath the barn floor, carving out a space 20 feet long and 14 feet wide. The walls were raw earth at first, but he knew exposed dirt would crumble and cave. So he lined every surface with fieldstone, quarried from the ridge 2 miles north. Each stone was fitted tight, no mortar, just careful placement and gravity. The floor was packed earth, covered with flat stones. The ceiling was timber beams, 8 inches thick, spanning the width and overlaid with planks. Above the planks, he piled 3 feet of earth for insulation and load distribution. Access was through a trapdoor in the barn floor. A wooden ladder, 12 rungs, led down. The hatch was double-layered, 2 thick planks with a 6-inch air gap between them, stuffed with wool batting. When closed, it sealed tight. Ventilation was critical. Samuel installed 2 metal pipes, each 4 inches in diameter. One pipe drew fresh air from outside, entering low on the north wall. The other pipe vented stale air and smoke, rising through the barn roof. The system was passive. No fans, no pumps, just convection and pressure differentials. Warm air rises. Cold air sinks. The pipes handled the exchange. Heat came from a small iron stove, no bigger than a flour barrel. The chimney pipe ran up through the ceiling, through the barn, and out the roof. Samuel lined the chimney opening with fire brick to prevent heat loss and protect the timbers. The total material cost was minimal. The fieldstone was free, hauled by hand. The timber beams came from trees on his own land. The iron stove was second-hand, purchased for $6 at the mercantile. The metal pipes were salvaged from an abandoned smelter operation. The wool batting came from their own sheep, carded and cleaned by Catherine and Margaret. Construction time. 6 weeks of hard labor, working alone except when Raymond helped haul stone. Jonas Milright came by in early November to inspect. He stood at the edge of the excavation, shaking his head. "You've built yourself a tomb, Garrett," Jonas said. "First heavy snow, and that ceiling will come down on you." "Timbers are load tested," Samuel replied. "I calculated the weight." "Calculated?" Jonas spat into the dirt. "I've built cabins for 30 years. I know what works. This don't." The valley thought Samuel was foolish. At the trading post, men made jokes. At church, women whispered. The storekeeper, a man named Hodge, told Catherine she should talk sense into her husband before he killed them all. "That hole's gonna flood first thaw," Hodge said, "or collapse, or fill with bad air and suffocate you in your sleep." Catherine did not argue. She just bought her supplies and left. But privately, she had doubts. The children asked questions she could not answer. What if the neighbors were right? What if the ceiling did collapse? What if the air went bad? Samuel spent evenings explaining the physics to her, drawing diagrams on scrap paper. He showed her how the earth insulates, how still air traps heat, how thermal mass, the stone walls, absorbs warmth during the day and radiates it back at night. He was patient, methodical, and certain. "It'll work," he said. "The earth doesn't lie." By late November, the family moved their bedding and essentials into the underground shelter. The barn remained above, housing livestock and tools. The cabin stood empty, used only for cooking and daytime tasks. At night, they descended the ladder and closed the hatch. The neighbors watched and waited for disaster. December brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped to 10 below zero, and the wind came screaming across the plains. In the valley's log cabins, families huddled close to their stoves, burning cord after cord of wood. The Hendersons, a mile south, went through half their winter supply in 3 weeks. The Ketchum family, 2 miles east, woke to frost on the inside walls, despite keeping the fire roaring all night. Samuel's family slept soundly. The underground shelter held steady at 58 degrees, with only a small fire in the iron stove. The fieldstone walls absorbed the stove's warmth and radiated it back slowly, evenly throughout the night. When the fire died to coals, the temperature barely dropped. The stone kept giving. Above ground, the wind hammered the barn, rattling boards and finding every crack. Below ground, the air was still. Perfectly still. No drafts, no cold spots, no fluctuations. The children slept without extra blankets. Catherine stopped worrying. But the valley had not seen real winter yet. December was just the warning. January arrived with a vengeance. On the morning of January 19th, the temperature dropped to minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind gusted to 50 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the valley. Visibility dropped to 0. The storm lasted 4 days. In the valley's cabins, families fought for survival. Wood supplies dwindled. Fires that roared at night barely kept the indoor temperature above freezing by morning. Children slept in their coats. Parents stayed awake in shifts, feeding stoves every hour. Frostbite was common. Hypothermia was a constant threat. The Ketchum family burned their furniture. The Hendersons rationed their wood, letting the fire die at night and huddling together for warmth under every blanket they owned. Jonas Milright's cabin, built with his 30 years of experience, dropped to 38 degrees inside, despite a fire that consumed a full cord every 2 days. Samuel's family stayed at 68 degrees. The small iron stove burned a few pieces of wood every 6 hours. The stone walls held the warmth. The earth insulated. The still air trapped the heat. Physics did not care about the storm outside. On the 3rd day, Raymond climbed the ladder to check the livestock in the barn above. He came back down shivering, his face red from the wind. "It's bad up there," he said. "Real bad." Samuel nodded. "Close the hatch." By the 4th day, the storm broke. The wind died. The temperature remained brutally cold, but the sky cleared. Neighbors emerged from their cabins to assess the damage. Livestock had frozen. Wood supplies were devastated. Several families faced the rest of winter with dangerously low fuel reserves. Jonas Milright stood in his doorway, staring across the valley toward Samuel's barn. Smoke rose from the chimney pipe. Thin, steady smoke. Not the thick billows that came from cabins burning wood desperately. Jonas walked over. It took him 20 minutes through the drifts. He found Samuel outside the barn, checking the livestock. "How'd you fare?" Jonas asked. "Fine," Samuel said. "Lost a chicken. Everything else is all right." Jonas looked at the barn, then back at Samuel. "Your family?" "Warm. No trouble." Jonas hesitated. "I'd like to see it." Samuel led him inside the barn and opened the hatch. Warm air rose from below, carrying the smell of wood smoke and stone. Jonas descended the ladder carefully, his boots finding each rung. At the bottom, he stopped. The air was warm, genuinely warm, not the desperate near heat of a cabin with a roaring fire. It was steady, even, comfortable. The stone walls radiated gentle warmth. Catherine and the children sat at a rough table, mending clothes. Ruth was barefoot. Jonas touched the stone wall. It was warm to the touch. "What's the temperature down here?" Jonas asked. 68 degrees, Samuel said. "Hasn't dropped below 65 all week." Jonas looked at the small iron stove. A few coals glowed inside. "That's it? That's all you're burning?" "A handful of wood every few hours," Samuel said. "Stone holds the heat. Earth keeps it in. No wind to steal it." Jonas walked the perimeter of the shelter, examining the fieldstone walls, the timber ceiling, the ventilation pipes. He was silent for a long time. "I was wrong," Jonas finally said. "I've been building wrong for 30 years." Word spread fast. By the end of January, half the valley had visited Samuel's underground shelter. They descended the ladder one by one, skeptics turned students. They touched the warm walls. They stood in the still air. They watched the tiny stove barely burning and felt the steady, reliable warmth. The math was simple. Samuel used 1/5 the firewood of a conventional cabin. His family slept comfortably in temperatures 30 degrees warmer than the valley's best-built homes. The structure required no complex tools, no expensive materials, and no specialized knowledge. Just an understanding of basic physics and a willingness to dig. The storekeeper, Hodge, came by in early February. He stood in the underground shelter for 10 minutes without speaking, then climbed back up the ladder. "I owe you an apology, Garrett," Hodge said. "I thought you were burying your family. Turns out you were saving them." By spring, 7 families had begun excavations. Jonas Milright helped 3 of them, applying his carpentry skills to Samuel's design. He stopped building conventional cabins and started digging. The technique spread through the valley, then to neighboring settlements. The Hendersons dug beneath their barn. The Ketchums expanded their root cellar into a living space. Even the wealthy landowner 3 miles north, a man who had mocked Samuel as that dirt miner, hired workers to excavate beneath his ranch house. Catherine watched the valley transform. "They laughed at you," she said to Samuel one evening. "Ridicule doesn't stop the cold," Samuel replied. The winter of 1888 brought another brutal cold snap. Temperatures dropped to -38 degrees for 2 weeks straight. But this time, the valley was ready. Families descended into their underground shelters and stayed warm. Firewood consumption dropped across the settlement. No one froze. No one burned their furniture. The children slept soundly. Jonas Milright visited Samuel in early March. They sat in the underground shelter, drinking coffee heated on the small iron stove. "I've been thinking," Jonas said, "about all those years I spent building cabins, all that wood I burned, all those cold nights." He shook his head. "I thought I knew what I was doing." "You built good cabins," Samuel said. "They just fought the wrong battle." "What do you mean?" "You tried to keep the cold out," Samuel said. "I decided to go where the cold couldn't reach." Jonas smiled. "That's the difference, isn't it? I was trying to win a fight. You walked away from it." The underground shelters became standard in the valley. By 1890, nearly every family had some version of Samuel's design. Some were elaborate, with multiple rooms and stone hearths. Others were simple, single-chamber excavations beneath existing structures. But they all shared the same principle. Depth equals stability, stone holds warmth, and still air preserves heat. Samuel's original shelter served his family for 23 years. Margaret married in 1894 and moved to Helena. Raymond took over the farm in 1900 and expanded the underground space, adding a second chamber for storage. Ruth married a surveyor and moved to Missoula in 1903. Catherine passed away in 1908. Samuel continued living in the underground shelter until his death in 1910 at the age of 65. The structure remained intact, used by Raymond's family through the harsh winter of 1919. By the 1920s, the valley began to change. Rural electrification arrived in 1924. Families installed electric heaters. The need for underground shelters diminished as modern heating systems spread. The old structures were repurposed: root cellars, storage spaces, workshops. Some were filled in and abandoned as the farms modernized. Jonas Milright lived to see the transformation. He died in 1927 at the age of 83, having spent the last 40 years of his life advocating for earth-sheltered construction. He never built another conventional cabin. The valley's underground shelters faded from use by the 1930s. A few remained as storage spaces. Most were filled in during the Depression, when families needed to maximize arable land and minimize maintenance. The knowledge did not pass to the next generation. The children who had slept warm in those stone chambers grew up, moved away, and forgot. But the physics did not change. Earth still insulates. Stone still holds heat. Still air still traps warmth. These principles remain constant regardless of technology or fashion. Samuel Garrett's underground shelter demonstrated what frontier families could achieve with observation, effort, and an understanding of basic thermodynamics. He did not invent Earth-sheltered construction. Humans have built underground for millennia. But he applied that ancient knowledge to the specific challenges of Montana Territory winters. And he did it without expert guidance, expensive materials, or community support. The valley laughed at him. Then winter proved him right. That is the pattern of innovation. Mockery, then validation, then imitation. The story raises questions about what we consider primitive and what we call progress. A man digs beneath his barn and saves his family. His neighbors, using conventional methods, struggle and suffer. The innovation costs almost nothing, uses local materials, and requires only labor and understanding. Yet it takes a crisis, a storm that brings -42 degrees and 4 days of wind, to force the community to reconsider their assumptions. How many other solutions have been dismissed because they looked wrong? How much frontier knowledge was lost because it did not fit conventional thinking? Samuel Garrett understood something fundamental. The earth itself is a resource. Not just the soil for planting, but the thermal mass beneath the surface. 8 feet down, the temperature holds steady year-round. That constancy is free, available, and utterly reliable. All it requires is the willingness to dig and the understanding to use it correctly. He learned it in the copper mines of Butte, 1,000 feet underground, where the rock walls never changed temperature, regardless of the season above. He brought that knowledge to his farm and applied it to his family's survival. The valley mocked him for it. Then winter made them students. If you are watching this from a cold climate, you understand the stakes. Winter is not romantic. It is not an inconvenience. It is a test. Those who fail that test do not get second chances. Samuel Garrett passed the test by refusing to fight on winter's terms. He did not try to heat a drafty cabin against 50-mile-per-hour wind. He did not burn cord after cord of wood in a losing battle against convection and infiltration. He walked away from the fight entirely and went underground where the cold could not reach him. That is not retreat. That is strategy. The validation came not from experts or authorities, but from a thermometer. 68 degrees inside versus -42 degrees outside. That is a 110-degree difference maintained with a handful of wood every few hours. The numbers do not lie. Physics does not negotiate. Jonas Milright, the master builder with 30 years of experience, had to admit he had been wrong. That admission took courage. He did not make excuses. He did not dismiss Samuel's design as a fluke. He examined it, understood it, and changed his entire approach to construction. That intellectual honesty is rare. The spread of underground shelters through the valley demonstrates how quickly innovation can propagate when survival is at stake. 7 families began excavations by spring. More followed the next year. Within a decade, the technique was standard practice. The knowledge moved from one skeptic to another, each conversion driven by direct experience rather than persuasion. No one was convinced by argument. They were convinced by walking into a 68-degree room when everything above ground was freezing. But here's the part people miss. The innovation eventually disappeared. By the 1930s, most of the underground shelters were abandoned or filled in. Modern heating made them unnecessary. The next generation grew up with electricity and oil furnaces. They did not need to understand thermal mass or earth temperature. They flipped a switch and the house got warm. That convenience came with a cost. The knowledge was lost. The skills were forgotten. The understanding of how to survive without modern infrastructure faded. When Samuel Garrett's grandchildren inherited the farm, they did not maintain the underground shelter. They did not teach their children how it worked. They filled it in and built a modern house with central heating. Progress is not linear. We gain new capabilities and lose old ones. Every generation inherits some knowledge and forgets other knowledge. The trick is knowing which knowledge matters when the systems we depend on fail. Samuel Garrett's underground shelter matters because it represents a category of solutions that require no supply chain, no experts, no manufactured components. It works with local materials, human labor, and basic physics. That kind of solution is resilient. It cannot be cut off by a broken supply line or a failed infrastructure. It exists independent of the systems we build on top of it. The question is whether that knowledge needs to be preserved or whether modern systems have made it obsolete. The answer depends on how confident you are that modern systems will never fail. If the power stays on forever, if supply chains never break, if heating fuel remains cheap and abundant, then Samuel Garrett's underground shelter is a historical curiosity. If any of those assumptions prove wrong, then his shelter is a blueprint. Consider the economics. Samuel's shelter cost almost nothing to build. The materials were free or salvaged. The labor was his own. The payoff was immediate and sustained. Lower fuel costs, reliable warmth, and peace of mind through brutal winters. Compare that to a modern heating system. High upfront cost, ongoing fuel expenses, vulnerability to power outages, and dependence on supply chains. Which system is more secure? Which system would you trust in a crisis? The validation moment, when Jonas Milright descended that ladder and felt the warm air rising, represents every moment when conventional wisdom confronts measurable reality and loses. Jonas had 30 years of experience. He had built dozens of cabins. He knew his craft. And he was wrong. Being wrong is not failure. Refusing to admit you are wrong is failure. Jonas did not defend his position. He examined the evidence, acknowledged his error, and changed his approach. That capacity to update beliefs in the face of new information is what separates learning from stubbornness. Samuel Garrett's story is not unique. Frontier America is full of forgotten innovations, techniques that worked, saved lives, and then vanished when circumstances changed. The challenge is identifying which of those techniques remain relevant and which are genuinely obsolete. Underground shelters remain relevant. Earth-sheltered construction is experiencing a resurgence in modern sustainable design. Architects are rediscovering what Samuel Garrett knew in 1887. Depth equals stability. Thermal mass stores energy, and still air insulates. The principles have not changed. The applications have. Before building any structure, especially one involving underground construction, consult with professional engineers and local building authorities. Modern codes exist for good reasons. Soil stability, water table management, structural load calculations, and safe ventilation. Samuel Garrett built in an era with no regulations and no safety oversight. He succeeded, but others attempting similar projects failed catastrophically. Do not replicate historical techniques without modern engineering analysis. That lesson That winter sides with physics, not convention, changed more than just building techniques in the valley. It changed how people thought about survival itself. By the spring of 1888, the transformation was visible. Every barn raising, every new homestead, every expansion included the same conversation. Where to dig, how deep to go, how to line the walls. The trading post stocked more iron pipe for ventilation. The blacksmith learned to fabricate custom chimney components for underground installations. The knowledge became infrastructure. But not everyone adapted at the same pace. 3 miles north, a wealthy cattle rancher named Preston Aldrich had watched the valley's transformation with barely concealed contempt. Preston owned 2,000 acres, employed 6 ranch hands, and lived in the largest house in the territory. A 2-story frame structure shipped in pieces from Chicago and assembled by craftsmen brought in from Denver. It had glass windows, painted trim, and a massive stone fireplace that consumed a cord of wood every 3 days. Preston considered himself a man of refinement. He wore tailored suits ordered from St. Louis. He drank imported whiskey. He had opinions about the territorial legislature and corresponded with politicians in Helena. He did not dig holes in the ground like a prairie dog. Garrett's turned this valley into a den of moles, Preston told anyone who would listen. Next, they'll be living in caves and eating roots. His ranch hands knew better. They had visited Samuel's shelter. They had felt the warmth, seen the efficiency, and done the math on firewood consumption. But Preston paid their wages, so they kept quiet. The winter of 1889 tested Preston's certainty. December brought temperatures that dropped to minus 35 degrees and stayed there for 10 days. Preston's house, despite its Chicago pedigree and Denver craftsmanship, could not hold heat. The rooms farthest from the fireplace froze. Water buckets turned to ice overnight. His wife and 2 daughters slept in the parlor, closest to the fire, wrapped in every blanket in the house. Preston burned through his entire winter wood supply by mid-January. He sent his ranch hands to cut more, but the cold made logging dangerous and slow. Green wood does not burn efficiently. The house stayed cold. On January 23rd, Preston swallowed his pride and rode to Samuel's farm. Samuel was outside the barn, repairing a harness. He saw Preston coming and waited. "Garrett," Preston said, dismounting. "I need to see your setup." "All right," Samuel said. They went into the barn. Samuel opened the hatch. Preston hesitated at the top of the ladder, a moment of visible reluctance, then descended. The warmth hit him immediately. 65 degrees of steady, comfortable heat. No roaring fire, no desperate fuel consumption, just quiet reliability. Preston stood at the bottom of the ladder for a full minute without speaking. "How much wood are you using?" Preston finally asked. "About 1/3 of a cord per week," Samuel said. "Sometimes less." Preston did the math. His house was consuming 2 cords per week and barely staying habitable. Samuel's shelter, with a fraction of the fuel, maintained warmth that Preston's expensive house could not match. "I need you to build one," Preston said. "At my ranch. I'll pay whatever you ask." Samuel shook his head. "I'm not a builder. I'm a farmer. But I'll show your men how to do it. No charge." Preston looked around the shelter again, at the fitted stones, the timber ceiling, the simple efficiency of it all. "Why no charge?" "Because," Samuel said, "winter doesn't care about pride. And I don't need people freezing because they can't afford to learn. Preston hired Jonas Milright to supervise the excavation. Samuel visited the ranch 3 times to advise on ventilation and stone placement. By March, Preston's ranch had an underground shelter beneath the main house, accessible through a reinforced hatch in the kitchen floor. It cost Preston more than it cost Samuel. Hired labor, purchased materials, professional consultation. But the principle was the same. The following winter, Preston's family slept underground. His wood consumption dropped by 70%. The ranch hands built their own shelter beneath the bunkhouse. Preston stopped making jokes about moles. The story spread beyond the valley. Travelers carried it to neighboring settlements. A land surveyor mentioned it in Helena. A territorial official wrote about it in a report to Washington. By 1890, earth-sheltered construction was being discussed in territorial building committees and homesteading guidebooks. But adaptation was slow and uneven. Some communities embraced it. Others dismissed it as backward. The conflict was not just practical, it was cultural. Earth-sheltered living carried associations with poverty, desperation, and failure. Successful homesteaders were supposed to build upward, not downward. A 2-story house signaled prosperity. A hole in the ground signaled defeat. Samuel understood the psychology but did not care about it. "I'd rather be warm than impressive," he told Catherine. The technique reached its peak adoption around 1895. By then, an estimated 40% of homesteads in the Northern Territories included some form of underground shelter. Construction methods had evolved. Better ventilation systems, improved waterproofing, more sophisticated heating arrangements. Some families built hybrid structures, conventional houses with underground sleeping quarters. Others went fully subterranean, with only ventilation pipes and chimney stacks visible above ground. The Montana Agricultural College sent a researcher to document the techniques in 1897. A young engineer named Thomas Brennan spent 3 months in the valley, measuring temperatures, calculating fuel efficiency, and interviewing families. His report concluded that earth-sheltered construction reduced heating costs by 60 to 80% compared to conventional log cabins, with no loss of comfort or safety when properly designed. Brennan's report should have changed frontier building standards. It did not. By the time he published his findings in 1900, the frontier itself was changing. Railroads brought cheaper lumber. Towns grew into cities. Building codes emerged, written by officials who had never spent a winter at minus 40 degrees. Earth-sheltered construction did not fit the new regulatory frameworks. It was too irregular, too difficult to standardize, too dependent on local soil conditions and individual skill. The knowledge began to fade. By 1910, new homesteaders were building conventional houses with purchased lumber and manufactured stoves. Underground shelters were seen as relics of a harder time, reminders of an era best forgotten. The families who still used them were considered old-fashioned, stubborn, or too poor to modernize. Samuel died that year, still living in the shelter he had built 23 years earlier. Raymond inherited the farm and continued using the underground space, but he built a conventional house above it for his wife, who wanted windows and a parlor. The shelter became secondary, a winter backup, a storage space, a conversation piece for visitors. Ruth visited in 1914 with her husband and 2 children. She descended the ladder with her eldest daughter and stood in the warm stone chamber. "I grew up here," Ruth told her daughter. "Every winter, we'd come down here and be warm while the whole valley froze." Her daughter looked around with polite confusion. "Why would you live underground?" "Because it worked," Ruth said. But she could see her daughter did not understand. The child had grown up in Missoula, in a house with a coal furnace and electric lights. The idea of surviving by digging beneath a barn was incomprehensible to her. It belonged to a different world. The Great War came and went. Rural electrification spread through the territories. By the 1920s, oil furnaces and electric heaters made underground shelters unnecessary for most families. The old structures remained, repurposed, neglected, or filled in. A few stubborn homesteaders kept using them, mostly elderly folks who had built them with their own hands and trusted them more than modern systems. Jonas Milright was one of them. He lived in his underground shelter until his death in 1927, maintaining it with the same care he had given to every structure he built. He left detailed notes describing the construction process, the physics principles, and the modifications he had developed over 40 years of refinement. His children donated the notes to the Montana Historical Society, where they gathered dust in an archive box for decades. The Depression brought a brief resurgence of interest. Families struggling to afford heating fuel rediscovered the economy of earth-sheltered living. A few new shelters were built in the early 1930s, usually by families who had lost their homes and needed cheap survival solutions. But these were seen as emergency measures, symbols of hardship rather than innovation. By 1940, the valley's underground shelters were mostly gone. Some had collapsed from lack of maintenance. Others had been deliberately filled in to reclaim the land. A few survived as root cellars or storm shelters, their original purpose forgotten. The children who had slept warm in those stone chambers were grandparents themselves, and they did not talk much about the old ways. Progress meant moving forward, not looking back. The knowledge survived in fragments. Old-timers remembered the principles even if they no longer practiced them. Farmers occasionally mentioned earth temperature when discussing root cellars. Engineers designing basements sometimes noted the thermal advantages of depth. But the integrated understanding, the complete picture of how earth-sheltered construction worked and why it mattered, largely disappeared. World War II brought new technologies and new priorities. Rural electrification reached nearly every farm. Oil and gas heating became standard. The housing boom after the war favored standardized construction methods that could be mass-produced and quickly assembled. Earth-sheltered building did not fit that model. It was too custom, too labor-intensive, too dependent on local conditions. By 1950, Samuel Garrett's underground shelter had been filled in for a decade. The barn above it had collapsed in a windstorm in 1943. Raymond's son sold the farm in 1948 to a wheat operation that bulldozed everything and plowed the land flat. No trace remained of the structure that had saved a family and changed a valley. But the physics did not change. Earth still insulates at depth. Stone still holds heat. Still air still traps warmth. These principles remain true regardless of whether anyone remembered or applied them. The lesson is not that we should return to 19th century construction methods. Modern building techniques offer real advantages: faster construction, better moisture control, improved structural engineering, and enhanced safety systems. The lesson is that we should understand the principles underlying historical solutions, because those principles remain applicable even when the specific methods evolve. Samuel Garrett succeeded because he understood heat transfer, thermal mass, and insulation, not as abstract academic concepts, but as practical survival tools. He applied that understanding to a specific situation, using the materials and labor available to him. The result was not perfect, But it worked. It kept his family warm through winters that killed others. That capacity to observe, understand, and apply fundamental principles to immediate problems is what made frontier survival possible. It is also what makes resilience possible in any era. When modern systems fail, whether through infrastructure collapse, supply chain disruption, or economic crisis, the people who survive are the ones who understand principles rather than just procedures. They know not just which button to push, but why the button works, and what to do when it does not. Samuel Garrett knew why his shelter worked. His descendants knew only that modern heating worked better. When the old shelter was filled in, they lost nothing of immediate practical value. But they lost the understanding that made the shelter possible in the first place. The question facing anyone interested in resilience is this: what knowledge are we losing right now that might matter later? What skills? What principles? What hard-won understanding is fading because current conditions make it seem unnecessary? We cannot preserve everything. Every generation must choose what knowledge to carry forward and what to leave behind. But we should make that choice consciously, understanding what we are losing and why. Samuel Garrett's underground shelter is gone. The valley that copied it has forgotten it. But the record remains in Brennan's report, in Jonas Milright's notes, and stories like this one. The knowledge survives, waiting for anyone who needs it. The end.